The room was filled with the clinking of cutlery, the chatter of relatives, and the warm glow of Christmas lights reflecting against polished silverware. I was trying to force myself to laugh along with a joke my brother-in-law had made when my phone buzzed against the table. At first, I thought to ignore it. Christmas Eve dinner was sacred, and no one wanted interruptions. But then I glanced down. An unknown number. Something about it gnawed at me, almost as if I had to answer. When I finally slid my thumb across the screen, I expected a telemarketer or maybe a wrong number. But the voice on the other end froze me in place. "Dad." My fork slipped from my hand and hit the floor. My heart slammed against my ribs. That voice, older, deeper, but still familiar. It couldn't be. My son had been gone for 7 years. Officially declared missing. Buried in grief, we'd mourned him without a body. Yet here he was. "Dad, listen to me carefully." The voice continued, low and urgent. "I don't have much time, and you can't tell anyone at the table." Before we continue, be part of our growing family by hitting that subscribe button. And here's something fun. Share your name and tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments. We might feature you with a shout out in our next video, because your support truly means the world to us. Now, let's proceed. Christmas Eve sounded like it always did in our house. The hush of snow pressing soft against the windows, the chiming carols my wife cued from the same 3 albums we'd played since the kids were small, the clink and scrape of plates where everyone tried too hard to behave like nothing important had ever gone missing from our lives. I busied my hands with the harmless things, refilling water, carving the turkey like it needed me, smiling when someone landed a joke, and told myself the weight I felt in my chest was only winter, only holiday air, only the gravity of a day that asked us to pretend the world was better than the evidence suggested. I was halfway to laughing at my brother-in-law's story about a can't-miss fund he'd shepherded into inevitable greatness when my phone began to buzz against the table. Unknown number. I had learned to ignore those after the 2nd year of silence, when grief had trained me that every withheld caller was a fresh wound and every heavy breath belonged to a stranger. Yet the digits flickered with a familiarity I couldn't explain, like a song you don't think you know, but somehow begin humming anyway. I felt my fingers moving before I decided to move them. I picked up. "Dad." The fork slipped from my hand and rang against the plate. That single syllable tightened the room into a narrow hallway where only one thing could pass. A voice, older by weather and miles, sanded at the edges and threaded with urgency, and still, as surely as taste remembers a childhood soup. The exact voice that had shouted for me from the back of a soccer field, that had once practiced a school presentation at the refrigerator door, that had called "Night, Dad," through the gap of a half-closed bedroom where a lamp was always left a little too long on. The room kept performing its ritual around me. My sister giggling at something, my wife's eyes doing their gentle inventory of who needed what, my brother-in-law topping his glass with a grin too white to be honest. The past wasn't supposed to happen in the present tense. But there it was, mouth pressed to my ear. I stood so slowly that no one had to notice me standing. "I'm here," I said, and I meant the kind of here that is a vow. "Where are you?" "Don't tell anyone I called," he said, and his breath came quick but controlled, a soldier's breath, a runner's breath, a boy I had taught to breathe through a stitch bending his rib cage around a stitch I had not the power to remove. "Go to the living room, behind the nativity set. Do it now. Stay on with me." I walked there like a man walking into an agreed-upon dream. The nativity was older than my adulthood, olive wood smoothed by years of dusting, and whispered apologies when we chipped the baby's left hand. I reached behind the rough stand and felt a seam give like a hinge had been waiting for my thumb for decades. The panel slid away. Taped inside with blue painter's tape was a small flash drive, the color of unlit steel, and beneath it a torn strip of paper. I peeled the paper free. For words slanted in a left-leaning hand I would have recognized in a pile of 1,000. "He sits across from you." The room seemed to tilt. Across from me at dinner sat my brother-in-law, still narrating his own success in a tone trained to fill rooms and leave no surface unglossed, his hand draped lazy over a chair he didn't buy, his eyes doing the quick arithmetic of a man who liked to be owed. Dad, my son said softly. Do you understand? What I understood rushed at me in layers. That the boy I'd mourned without a body had grown into a man speaking through bone-deep caution. That a note could be a map or a trap. That the difference between those two would be decided by whether I could be the version of myself who listened before he leapt. Say nothing, he went on. There's a place and time on the drive. Go alone. If anyone follows, don't go in. The tin under the front left pew at St. Matthew's has your next step. Leave the house in 20 minutes for the church. Pretend it's a walk. If he offers to drive, say no. He paused, and there was a sound I hadn't known I'd been craving for 7 winters. A small exhale that belonged to him. I'm sorry for the years, Dad. I didn't choose them. I chose this. I steadied my voice on the mantel. Are you safe? I asked. The quiet that followed was precise, not empty. A choice, not an absence. I will be, he said, if you do exactly what I wrote. The call ended with no goodbye, which felt right. I had used up my goodbyes in the first year and found them to be poor investments. I slipped the drive into my pocket, the note into my sleeve, and when I returned to the table, the room welcomed me like a theater that never breaks character mid-scene. My wife has a way of asking without words, a single brow lifting as if to steady something that shouldn't fall. I answered with the faintest nod a man can make without moving air. My brother-in-law's smile held, but a tendon in his jaw tightened, the kind of muscle movement a man's groomer can't fix and his dentist can't file away. I finished chewing nothing. I stood with my plate to take it to the sink and lingered just long enough to let habit cover me like a cloak. Rinse, rack, towel, pour coffee I wouldn't drink. When I announced to no one and everyone that I might slip to St. Matthew's after dessert to walk, to pray, to remember my mother's carols on old wood pews, I draped the words in a kind of self-mocking nostalgia that made it easy to overlook. The dog needed letting out. My sister wanted pie. The kids argued about whether whipped cream counted as a side dish. I waited 20 minutes that stretched and stretched like cooling sugar. In my study, I tucked the drive into the laptop with the tenderness of a man whose learned machines can be the only way a lost voice finds its way back. A single folder bloomed open, 3 files. A text document named Dad, read first. A small brass key with a fob stamped 014, a folded map of town with 3 streets shaded in pencil, and a Polaroid of a boxy gray SUV dusted with salt, the plate matching the numbers in the file. On the back of the photo, his left slanting hand again. If you see this car, turn around. He's not alone. I closed the tin and slid the key into my inner coat pocket where a man used to keep cigarettes. When I raised my head, the sanctuary felt different in that way rooms do when you've removed one thing that no one else knows is missing. The choir rehearsed something soft over the speakers. A custodian rolled a card across the back. A child's voice squealed and was shushed with a hush that contained love and an invitation to remember your own childhood hushes. And then I saw him. At the side aisle, pretending interest in a pamphlet titled A Christmas for the Lonely, stood my brother-in-law. The way he looked away when our eyes met confirmed the lie of the pamphlet. He had followed. He had left our house quickly after me and found his way inside quietly and already knew how to look like a man who belonged anywhere. A smaller man would have confronted him then, called him out in that sacred space, and let voices do the work that evidence had not done. But I have learned across 7 winters that people devoted to their own narratives cannot be argued off them. They have to be revealed to themselves in a mirror they can't smash, in a scene where the roles are assigned by something larger than charisma. I bowed my head again, as if to pray. When I lifted it, he was gone. On the walk to the car I used to drive my son around in. The car he teased me for keeping too long, then confessed he loved for its stubbornness. I counted my steps and my breaths and the empty spaces between streetlights. A block down the hill, a gray SUV rolled past at the speed of a man who believes most rules are merely the world's suggestions. Plate 7KT 391. The driver's silhouette was familiar in the generic way ambitious men render themselves. A slope of hair like a magazine, a scarf knotted just so, posture that discontinued apologies at the source. I let the car pass and stood at a bus stop as if waiting for anyone but him. When the SUV vanished, I didn't move until a second full minute had chewed itself across my phone's clock, because I have also learned that traps don't spring the moment you see them. They wait for the moment you believe you didn't. The key in my pocket seemed heavier with each breath I took on the way to the Orchard cold storage facility at the edge of town. On winter nights, that building turned the horizon into a long, low sentence. As a boy, I'd pressed my forehead to the passenger window and watched the ice-rimmed roof sail by and wondered what could possibly need to be kept so cold for so long. As a man, I learned the ugliest answers are always money, secrets, people. I pulled into a narrow slot between two abandoned vans, killed the lights, and watched the entrance. The guard booth sat empty, the glass smeared with the fingerprints of a man who swore he cleaned it. Wind sang in the chain links with the thinness of a blade. I walked to Unit 14 like someone walking into a bad dream that is also the only dream that brings news. The brass key slid into the lock like it had been cut by someone who knew the shape of my hand. The door groaned. Cold poured over me the way truth does when you've been holding a different story in your ribs. The room was small, a box with walls an unkind shade of industrial and no space for illusions. But it had been prepared by a mind that had grown beyond boyhood in hiding. A single work lamp clipped to a beam, a cheap folding table, milk crates labeled in a tidy script, and at the back, spray painted on the concrete in letters that wavered just enough to tell me the painter's hand had been shaking. "Dad, I knew you'd come." The words hit me harder than the cold. I put a hand on the wall because it was either the wall or the floor. I let myself have 5 seconds, and then I did what the crates demanded. Each was marked with dates and simple nouns: donations, inventory, gala, vendor list, receipts, plates. I lifted the lid of a crate labeled phones and found cheap burners wrapped in rubber bands, each with a sticky note naming a week. In another, flash drives like the one in my pocket, each labeled with a location. Beneath the table sat a banker's box with my name written on the lid. Inside lay photocopies of paperwork that should never have shared a header. The charity my sister chaired, the logistics company my brother-in-law bragged about, the parish's holiday budget. And across the bottom of each, near-legible scribbles tying quantities of donated winter coats to shipping codes that any half-decent investigator would recognize as cover for moving something that wasn't fleece. In the corner, a small radio hissed carrier waves into the room. Not music, but not nothing. On the table, a cheap phone buzzed. No number. I answered. "Dad?" My son said, so close it felt like the room got warmer. "Don't speak yet. You're being watched. The camera is above the light. It's mine. I'm making a record." I looked up at the clamp light and saw, just above it, a dot that blinked green. "What is this?" I asked anyway, because some words are compelled by their own gravity. He exhaled that familiar half-laugh he used as a boy when he had told the truth and knew it would sound like a lie. "The part where you find out that the worst person in the room was never the loudest," he said. "The man across from you. He found out I'd stumbled onto it. He sold my number and my picture to the wrong people when he thought it would buy him a seat at the table. But he isn't the table." The door rattled then, a metal shiver like a cough. My spine did what spines do when survival is remembered. "They followed me," I whispered. "No," he said. "He followed you. He thinks he's alone." He paused. "Then, he never is." I killed the lamp and stood in the dark with the kind of quiet that sharpens you into useful shapes. Footsteps, 2 sets, approached in a rhythm stuttered by the cold. I recognized my brother-in-law's confident clip and a second, lighter step that sounded like the kind of man who gets paid for carrying the weight other men won't be seen with. "You sure he came here?" A voice whispered, unfamiliar and hungry. "He said he was going to church," my brother-in-law said, and even his whisper tried to smile. He never could leave things alone. The lock turned against a spare key I hadn't considered he might have. The door opened an inch, then 2, then enough for breath. I moved to the side, pressed flat to the wall where a man searching forward with his flashlight beam wouldn't find me first. The lamp cord scraped the concrete as the door's draft tugged it. In the dull glow, my brother-in-law's face appeared, compressed by caution into a shape I had never seen in our living room. A predator trying to look like scenery. "Hello," he said softly, like kindness could coax a response out of a room that didn't know him one. The second man stepped in behind him, big enough to make the doorframe look obliging. "Looking for something?" I asked, and my voice sounded like it had learned a new language in the last hour. He swung the light at me, and I winced against it, but didn't look away. I saw him measure the odds. Lines of numbers ran behind his eyes like stock tickers. He smiled then, relief rehearsed. "Thank God," he said, which was nearly funny in a storage locker that had been used to move things only devils appreciate. "Your wife was worried. I thought I'd give you a lift." The second man let the door click shut behind him and posted up there like a coat rack that charged rent. "Who's your friend?" I asked. "Security," he said quickly. "I needed some documents from work anyway. Figured we'd swing by." He trained the light away from my face and at the crates he could not afford for me to understand. "What is all this?" he asked, as if he hadn't already known the answer before he turned the handle. "It's evidence," I said, "and it's yours." The words softened as it left my mouth because it didn't feel fully true. My son had said he wasn't the table. Then who? As if in answer, the cheap phone on the table buzzed again. I picked up and hit speaker. A car engine idled somewhere on the other end. Wind. And then a voice I didn't know but had heard announce Christmas Eve services since I was a boy floated into the room. Calm, sonorous, practiced. "Daniel," said Reverend Hale, our town's pastor, the man who had baptized my son and pressed my hand at the graveside of my father and smiled at me from pulpits as if the world could be soothed into decency. "Let's not do this theatrically. You found what you came to find. Be a good man and walk away." My brother-in-law's head whipped toward the phone as if it had bitten him. The big man at the door's posture changed, a respectful tilt as a soldier gives a general. I stared at the phone like it had just confessed to murder in a children's library. "Reverend," I said, and my voice went hoarse on the word. "How, why?" "Because you kept coming to me," he said as gently as a bedtime story. "You came with your grief and your prayers, and some of those prayers contained information I needed. I used that information to keep certain programs functioning. Don't be naive, Daniel. Charity is logistics. Logistics is money. Money is power. And power does what it wants in winter and calls it mercy." For a moment, the cold felt like heat. I reached for the wall because I needed a fact to touch. "You took him," I whispered. "No," he said, almost pitying. "You lose a boy like that to the world. I guided where the world sent him. And I am guiding you now. Put down the phone, go home to your family, and let men finish men's work." The second man's hand moved toward his coat. My brother-in-law's face tried to rearrange into a new narrative that did not have room for him in the starring role. He looked small for the first time since I'd known him. What happened then was a choreography my son had planned without my knowledge and with my instinct written into it anyway. The lamp snapped back to full brightness of its own accord. The green dot above it burned steady. Outside, tires ground through slush. The door behind the big man rattled with conviction, not hesitation. He started to turn. The door flew open hard enough to smash his shoulder, and he stumbled, surprised, into a kneel. A woman stepped in, winter pale and sharp, the kind of sharp that's been honed by hard years and chosen mornings. I knew her from the edges of our lives. The neighbor girl who had babysat once. The kid who'd outgrown this town and then come back quieter. The woman whose mother I had seen in a church basement handing out food with dignity. She held a phone up like a cross and said, "You're live, Reverend." Her voice shook with something that wasn't fear. "Thousands across the county are watching, and your plate just pulled into frame." If truth is a temperature, the room changed then. The big man, suddenly aware of the kind of fight he hadn't signed for, raised his hands in the universal language of hired help who has just realized the hiring party's name will not protect him. My brother-in-law pivoted, calculating, always calculating, toward the woman with the phone, finding no purchase. And Reverend Hale's voice, that familiar balm, curdled into something clipped. "Maya," he said to the woman, and the sound of her name in his mouth placed her in a story he believed he authored. "Think about your mother's rent." The woman's jaw jumped. Think about all the mothers whose kids went missing on your watch, she said. Think about the coats that weren't coats. You ran scripture like a ledger. She angled her screen. Say hello. We're at Orchard Cold Storage, Unit 14. The good Reverend says charity is logistics. I didn't know this woman as well as I should have, but I knew the look she wore. The look my son had when he was 10 and told me the truth about breaking a neighbor's fence before stepping outside to fix it in the rain. She turned the screen toward me like a friend bringing a tray to a hospital bed. He's on deck, she mouthed. I swallowed and didn't understand until the cheap phone on the table buzzed a third time and my son's voice filled the room with a steadiness that acted like heat. Evening, Pastor, he said, not bothering to make the title sound like anything but a convenience. Thank you for the free distribution network. You're on camera. The God you serve now is called evidence. He paused just long enough for breath to become a line break. Dad, he said then, quietly, like the moment required softness from someone, and he'd elected himself. You did good. Step back. I saw it all as if from outside my body, my feet moving behind the table, my hands lowering. My brother-in-law, sweat beating a clean line to his collar, did the thing men like him do when the script collapses. He attempted to write a new one live, for the benefit of anyone still willing to be audience. Listen, he began, spreading his hands. We were trying to keep the charity afloat. The supply chain. Maya barked a laugh that had been waiting years to be born. Say supply chain again, she said, and tell the nice people on the internet how the coats weighed more on the second leg of the trip. Reverend Hale's voice rose an inch. Cut the feed, Maya. He'd dropped her name like a stone into a well. Nothing came back up. No, she said. You cut the kids. The big man's eyes met mine as if asking for permission to put down what he was holding that we couldn't see, and I was in no position to grant absolution. No one has to get hurt, I said, and meant it and didn't. It's already done, my son said through the phone. You just didn't know where to look. Behind my brother-in-law, Blue washed the walls with that particular winter police light that makes everyone look like they've been underwater a long time. Sirens found their voices and then turned them down respectfully, as if arriving at church. Reverend Hale's voice changed again, pastor to patron to defendant all in the space of 2 minutes, and I heard the engine on his end shift from idle to intention. You won't be able to prove the chain, he said, as if bargaining with a weather system. You never understood that people don't care where the warm comes from in winter. The door to Unit 14 opened fully, not from the men inside, but from the officers whose faces I recognized from summer fairs and school assemblies, and the time they'd let me sit in silence in a station hallway without asking me to stop. They looked surprised in the way professionals aren't supposed to look. The surprise of walking into a story you thought you knew the ending to and discovering the author is still writing. Maya kept the camera steady, a lighthouse set on a crate. My brother-in-law's mouth ran out of spin. He tried a final gambit, the one that had opened so many doors in his life. He looked at me as if I might be the door this time. Daniel, he said, and my name in his mouth had the wrong shape entirely. Family. The word hit the wall and slid down. Every year I had watched him lift a glass and say the word, and now I knew it was a spell he cast to keep himself at the head of any table he didn't set. I thought of the note in my sleeve. He sits across from you. I had read it as an accusation. It turned out to be an instruction for how to stop him, not with a revelation shouted, but with a mirror held up, calmly, at the right angle. I'm done sitting across from you, I said. My voice surprised me. It was simple, and men like him are unarmed against simple. The big man put his hands behind his head. My brother-in-law tried to look like a man ready to cooperate. The officers did the quiet work that keeps a town from coming apart. They separated people into their rightful distances. In the doorway, the chief met my eye and then looked at the crates with a question. He recorded them, I said, nodding at the light. He kept receipts. I touched the spray-painted words on the wall with my fingertips because I needed something human to carry through this moment besides anger. Where is he? The chief asked softly, meaning my son, meaning the boy the official papers had given up on but the town had not. The phone on the table buzzed again like a heartbeat finally heard by someone with a stethoscope. Here, my son said, and the here landed in the room with the thud of a gift that required 2 hands. Almost. He let out a breath that sounded like a promise kept to himself. Put me on speaker, he said. I did. Sound filled the locker big enough to move unthinkable things. Reverend, my son said, and for a second he was the altar boy he'd been. Voice pure and exact. Tell everyone the phrase you use to end your meetings. Silence, the kind that fluorescents hum into, stretched a note too long. Then, maybe because men like him are unable not to perform even when the audience has turned, the Reverend obliged. Go in peace, he said, and the phrase landed in the room like an ordinary napkin on a crime scene table, until my son continued, and prosper. The chief's eyes flicked to Maya, to me, to the crates labeled receipts, to the crates labeled plates, and then to the officers whose pens were already up. You heard that? He asked the room. Everyone heard that, Maya said, half laughing now, an astonishment that had heat in it. 3,000 and climbing. The big man closed his eyes like a soldier who had followed orders so long he'd forgotten which ones had names on them. My brother-in-law sat heavily on the crate-marked phones as if the universe had arranged symbolism just for me. Cuffs, the chief said gently, as if even the word might bruise a holiday too badly if spoken harshly. Metal talked softly in the cold room. The Reverend's engine grew louder at the other end, then cut. Doors thudded. Somewhere outside a voice shouted a name I had never thought I would hear shouted like that. Harold Hale. The line went dead. I didn't realize I'd been clenching my jaw until the muscles protested their servitude and the room blurred. The truth had been so long in arriving that its weight surprised me, like a child who grows while you aren't looking and then leaps into your arms and knocks you backward. Maya lowered the phone and gave me a look I wanted to frame. Not pity, not victory, but something like mutual acknowledgement that the world breaks, and sometimes we get to be present when someone starts to knit it back together. He wanted you to have this, she said, producing a small worn wallet from her coat and placing it on the table with ceremony. My fingers hesitated above it, as if touching it might summon or dismiss a ghost. Inside lay a photograph with 3 creases and a corner mended with tape. Me and my son and my wife under the cotton candy sunset 2 summers before he vanished, our smiles plain and unperformed. Behind the photo, a folded note, newer than the photo but already handled 100 times. Don't be brave. Be careful. You taught me that on the ice the winter I was 9. I swallowed the stone in my throat because I refused to drown in rooms my son designed for breathing. The officers moved through their practiced ballet of scene and evidence and statements. I said the things that needed saying with the calm of a man who sees the shore after a swim he didn't plan but refused to stop. My brother-in-law tried on 2 or 3 new stories and found none fit. The chief asked me if I needed someone to call. I've got someone, Maya said, already texting with speed that made her fingers look like weather. Outside, the night had that December theater quality where every breath seems to stand up in the air and audition. The sirens receded down the road with Reverend Hale in tow, a choral contradiction that sounded like a hymn played backwards. When the paperwork had begun and other rooms had been designated for other versions of the night, I stepped past the threshold of Unit 14 and stood under a sky that had earned its cold. I listened to the distant tires chew the town's edges. I tried to imagine what shape relief might take if it were a thing you could hold. And then I didn't have to imagine. He stepped from the shadow of a truck 2 units down with the caution of someone who'd lived by caution and hadn't yet taught his body that tonight could make another choice. He was taller than the last day I'd seen him, in the way men suddenly are when boys go into hiding and grow undercover. The hat he wore was a stupid old beanie I recognized immediately, the one my wife had threatened to throw out so many times and never did. He moved with an economy that I recognized as my own and didn't, the way you walk when you've learned every step costs something. I didn't rush him because we had both earned the right to arrive at the same place without tripping over need. He stopped an arm's length away. His eyes did not look like a miracle's eyes. They looked like his. Dad? He said, and the word landed like a piece of furniture set down in a house that had waited for it. Then he said, He trailed off because language sometimes understands when it is no longer necessary. What he said finally wasn't cinematic. It was the kind of thing a man says when he knows promises will be work and work will be promises. "I'm not coming home tonight," he said, and my breath hitched and kept going. "I have to finish the last part. They'll want to see me testify. There are other kids whose names don't make the paper, and I promised them I'd show up. But I will come home. I will walk in your door with both feet. I will sit down." He glanced at the open unit as officers cataloged the evidence he'd gathered at personal cost. I needed to make sure that when I did, it wouldn't be for a night and then gone again. I nodded with my whole body because sometimes you have to give your answer a size equal to the moment. I put my hand on his shoulder the way I had after Little League losses when I wanted him to learn the difference between failure and outcome. He leaned his forehead briefly to mine in a gesture he'd inherited without permission. The world made a small sound I cannot describe, like ice settling on a lake. Maya stood at a respectful distance, phone lowered, eyes bright with the knowledge of what she'd helped midwife. "You gave me your last $20 once," she said quietly into the air, not as a boast, just as a fact furrowing its way back into use. "At the gas station. I was 19. You told me to pay it forward, and I didn't know how to do that until now." My son chuckled, a dry sound that nevertheless landed like a blanket. "You paid it forward with interest," he said. She shrugged the way people shrug when they've finally done a thing they've rehearsed forever. "It's Christmas Eve," she said. "I figured the math would pencil. We didn't do the movie thing. There were no speeches or melodramatic swells, no slow-motion embraces scored to predictable instruments." I walked him to the edge of the lot where the snow had gathered itself into small armies along the curb, and I said the only thing that mattered. "You aren't alone," I told him, and I meant it as a statement of the present, not a wish for the future. He nodded as if sealing a contract that had waited 7 winters for signatures. He pointed to the horizon where the old fruit orchards made black lace against the sky. "New Year's benefit," he said. "The last checkmate. He'll be there in spirit, if not in person. The donors will pretend they didn't know. We'll help them remember." I almost laughed, not because any of it was funny, but because grief had finally loosened its hand on my throat and laughter needs so little space to live. "Go in peace," I said, and then added what the Reverend always added but meant it clean, "and prosper." He smiled, small, real, unphotogenic in the way truth never quite flatters, and stepped back toward the borrowed truck with the caution he'd promised to keep until it no longer served him. I watched until the taillights became 2 disciplined stars, and then turned back toward the locker where the officers were still doing the blessed, boring work of paperwork that keeps the fragile parts of a town from flying loose. On the walk to my car, the night felt different around my shoulders, not lighter, not heavier, but properly weighted at last, like a coat tailored for a body that has changed shape and finally fits again. When I opened the driver's door, a scrap of paper fell from the visor and landed in my lap. I hadn't put it there. The handwriting slanted left. "Check the back of the Nativity," it read. "One more thing you forgot to find." I laughed then, a sound unsteady with relief and electric with fear that dared to call itself joy. I drove home on streets my son had mapped for me, the world softly glittering with the kind of cold that makes breath visible, as if the town had elected to exhale together after holding itself tense for 7 long years. At home, the house still wore the sounds of Christmas. Low conversation, plates finding sinks, a child asleep on a couch with a candy cane melted into his palm. My wife met me at the door with a look I will describe to no one because it belongs only to us. I nodded, which was how we had been saying entire paragraphs lately. I went to the Nativity and reached behind the panel again. This time, there was not a drive, not a note, but something so ordinary and so impossible that I had to sit down before my legs decided to teach me humility the hard way. My son's old house key, the one with the split ring I'd replaced after he lost it the first winter he was allowed to bike to the library alone. Taped to the key was a torn line from a church program, the kind of thing that gets tucked into pockets and washed and found again months later in the lint tray. On it, his 4 words that had started all of this in my blood. "He sits across from you." And below them, In smaller writing, I had to hold to the tree lights to see, but I'll sit beside you soon. I closed my hand around the key and felt its notches settle into my skin the way memories do when they agree to stop cutting and start carving. In the dining room, I raised my glass when someone said to family, and this time the word did not hit the wall and slide down. It stood up on its own 2 feet and took a chair. Outside, the snow continued its patient work of making the world look new by morning, which is either a lie or a promise depending on your appetite for miracles. Me, I have learned to live somewhere between the two, where a phone can ring in the middle of dinner and return a voice to you trained yourself not to hear at night anymore, and where a man can say, "Go in peace and prosper," without meaning profit, only the plain prosperity of a door opening, a hand on a shoulder, a long breath let out, and a seat at a table finally filled in. And if anyone ever asks, then he said, I will tell them the truth that needs no embellishment. He said, Dad, and after that, words were optional. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us.